The midnight freight train didn't slow for the platform. It screeched against iron rails until sparks lit the falling snow, dumping me into 3 feet of sub-zero drift with nothing but a bruised collarbone and a stolen ticket. 12 Blacktown cars already idled in the blizzard. Their headlights cut through the frost, blinding every exit. A man in a charcoal shearling coat stepped directly into the storm. He didn't carry chains or a bounty ledger. He wrapped 40 pounds of warm wool around my shivering shoulders, his fingers grazing the burned scar beneath his own collar. "You took 7 years to find your way north, Genevieve," he whispered. My abusive southern fiancé had promised 20 armed men would drag me back by sunrise. If you've ever run into darkness because staying in the light was slowly killing you, you already know the feeling. I used to bandage dying men in the harbor ruins. But looking into Cassian Drake's cold eyes, I couldn't tell if I had found a savior, or the beast who owned the winter. If you've ever felt the absolute terror of walking toward a man everyone warned you would destroy you, tell me what city you are watching from tonight. The wind off the northern gorge howled like a wounded wolf, tearing through the steam vents beneath the locomotive. My boots were soaked through to the wool socks, the skin of my ankles numb and burning with frost. In the southern delta, winter meant cold rain on cypress bark. Up here, winter was a wall of white granite that could freeze a man's lungs before his second scream. I clutched my thin canvas travel satchel against my ribs. Inside was nothing but 2 dry crusts of rye bread, a rusted brass pocket watch that had stopped ticking when my father died, and the counterfeit third-class transit ticket I had purchased from a back-alley runner in New Savannah. Except the ticket hadn't been counterfeit. When the southern border inspectors had boarded the freight cars at midnight, shouting names and checking identity seals, they had pulled 3 men out into the mud. When the lead officer reached my crate, shining an acetylene lantern into my face, he had grabbed my paper pass with leather gloves. I had braced myself for the blow, for the click of iron cuffs around my wrists and Garrick Thorne's triumphant sneer. Instead, the inspector's lantern had caught the watermark in the corner of the ticket. A silver raven, wings flared over crossed railroad spikes. The officer's face had gone the color of unbaked dough. He didn't ask my name. He didn't demand a travel permit. He had stepped backward, bowed his head so low his chin touched his collar, and slammed the freight door shut, bolting it from the outside with a private lock. Now, standing on the frostbitten platform of Highstone station, I understood why. The 12 town cars formed a curved wall of heavy steel and idling engines, blocking the howling blizzard from reaching where I stood. Not a single driver moved. They stood beside their open doors in tailored wool overcoats, black leather gloves clasped behind their backs, their faces obscured by the shadow of broad-brimmed hats. On the right hand of every man gleamed a heavy obsidian signet ring, carved with a winged raven over crossed iron rails. The Drake crest. "Can you walk, Genevieve?" Cassian's voice cut through the roar of the blizzard, low and gravelly, like heavy iron wheels rolling over crushed granite. I tried to step forward, but the cold had settled deep into my joints. My knees buckled beneath the weight of the sodden wool coat he had thrown over me. Before my knees could strike the ice, Cassian's arm caught me beneath the ribs. He didn't haul me up like an enforcer dragging an escaped fugitive. His grip was steady, immovable, the heat radiating through his heavy shearling coat so intense it made my shivering skin sting with sudden warmth. The scent of cedar smoke, bitter espresso, and gun oil wrapped around me in the freezing gale. "I can walk," I lied, my teeth chattering so violently the words came out in jagged pieces. "I didn't come to beg for your charity, Mr. Drake. If Garrick Thorne paid you to intercept the train, tell me what the bounty is." "I have 18 silver coins and a watch." Cassian didn't laugh. His jaw remained set like carved river stone, a faint silver line running along his left temple and disappearing into his dark, frost-dusted hair. His eyes were the color of stagnant river ice, calm, lethal, and impossible to read. Garrick Thorne doesn't have enough gold in his southern vaults to buy a single coal car from this rail line, he said quietly. Get in the car before your toes turn black. He didn't wait for my consent. He opened the rear door of the lead Packard, shielding the roof with his broad forearms so my head wouldn't bump the frame as he guided me into the leather interior. The heat inside the car hit me like a physical wall. A brass foot warmer glowed beneath the velvet floor mat. On the center armrest sat a thermos flask of hot ginger tea and a folded blanket of thick merino wool. This was not an arrest. It was an ambush of luxury in the middle of a frozen wasteland. As Cassian slid into the seat beside me, shutting the heavy door against the gale, the entire convoy surged forward in unison. The tires bit into the packed ice of the mountain road, winding upward through pine-shadowed cliffs toward the fortress of Highstone Manor. I pulled the merino wool up to my chin, my fingers trembling as the blood slowly returned to my palms. Why did your ticket have my name on the manifest? I asked, looking sideways at him through the dim dashboard glow. I bought that pass from a stranger in an alley behind the cotton mills. Cassian looked out the frosted window, his profile sharp against the passing snowdrifts. The stranger in the alley works for my 3rd Division, Genevieve. Every carriage that leaves the southern basin is logged before the firebox is lit. When Garrick Thorne announced your wedding date 3 weeks ago, my men were ordered to leave boarding passes at every depot between the coast and the river. My breath caught in my throat. The interior of the car suddenly felt too small. You've been watching the Thorne estate? I've been watching Garrick Thorne since the night he ordered the St. Jude Harbor fire 7 years ago, Cassian replied, his voice dropping an octave, cold and absolute. I spent 7 years laying steel across this gorge and building an empire no southern court could touch, waiting for you to realize that a bird doesn't negotiate with the hawk that locked her cage. If you love stories where a man's cold power becomes the only shield between a vulnerable woman and the monsters who hunted her, take a moment to subscribe to Raven Vow. The iron gates of Highstone Manor parted without a sound as our motorcade swept past stone watchtowers. The estate was an iron and stone bastion built against the granite ridge of the northern mountains, its slate roofs dusted with thick powder, warm golden light spilling from narrow, arched windows. Cassian led me through slate flagstones and silent gray-liveried staff, no curious whispers, no mocking glances like the Thorne maids used to cast whenever I scrubbed the parlor hearth. At the top of the oak staircase, he pushed open a pair of heavy mahogany doors. These are your quarters, he said, stepping aside to let me enter. The room was vast, anchored by a roaring fieldstone fireplace that threw amber embers across a dark wool rug, and a four-poster bed draped in crimson velvet. I walked straight to the hearth, holding my hands to the flames, but the heat could not warm the question hammering in my chest. I looked back at the entrance. Where is the key? Cassian leaned against the doorframe, his hands resting easily in the pockets of his dark wool trousers. There is no key for that side of the door. The brass deadbolt is on yours. When you turn it, no one in this house can enter, not my captains, not the staff, and not me. I stared at him, my pulse racing. In the South, women don't get deadbolts on their doors. You are 500 miles north of the South, Genevieve, Cassian said, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made the room breathless. In Highstone, nobody enters a room unless they are invited. Rest tonight. In the morning, we talk about what Garrick Thorne took from you. He turned, pulling the door closed until the latch clicked into place. I stood in the silence, then walked to the door and slid the heavy brass deadbolt home. It slid smoothly into the strike plate, solid as an iron vault. On the nightstand beside the bed, illuminated by the firelight, sat a small blue porcelain tin. I picked it up with shaking fingers and unscrewed the lid. The sharp, clean aroma of dried mountain lavender, menthol, clover honey, and beeswax rose into the air. My heart dropped through the floorboards. This was not commercial apothecary salve. It was the exact, handmade burn remedy my grandmother used to brew in our harbor cottage in St. Jude. After the fire 7 years ago destroyed our home, my grandmother had died with the recipe in her head. I had only ever made that salve once with my own hands. 7 years ago. For a teenage boy who had pulled 3 harbor children from a burning warehouse, suffering second-degree burns across his entire collarbone, before disappearing into the midnight smoke without leaving a name. I sank onto the edge of the velvet bed, clutching the porcelain tin to my chest, and let the tears I had held back through 3 days of terror spill over my eyelashes into the warm firelight. Cassian Drake had not intercepted my train by chance. He was the boy from the St. Jude fire. By dawn, the blizzard had cleared, leaving the northern valley blanketed in blinding white powder beneath a steel-gray sky. Smoke rose from locomotive repair shops and iron foundries that fed the entire Northern Republic. I washed my face in warm rosewater, dressed in the dark green wool gown and shearling-lined boots left for me, and took the sealed parchment envelope bearing the St. Jude wax seal down the covered glass walkway to the Highstone Roundhouse. The Roundhouse was a colossal circular depot where 24 railway tracks converged on a massive central turntable plate, a colossal circular iron disc powered by high-pressure steam gears that could pivot an entire 100-ton locomotive in seconds. At the center of the upper catwalk sat the glass-walled office. Cassian was standing over a drafting table with Captain Joshua Sterling, whose beard was frosted from morning patrol. "Hold them at the outer switchyard," Cassian commanded as I entered. "Let Declan Cole see the marksman on the water tower. If he steps off the carriage, bring him up here alone." Sterling nodded respectfully, tipping his cap to me as he exited. Cassian straightened, his linen shirt open at the throat. In the crisp morning light through the glass cupola, I saw it clearly. Spanning from his left collarbone down across his chest to his fourth rib was a thick, jagged tapestry of pale, raised scar tissue, the exact diagonal footprint of the burning oak timber that had collapsed from the St. Jude harbor roof. I stepped to the table, holding up the blue porcelain tin. "How did you get this?" Cassian looked at the tin, his gaze softening. "You gave me the first batch when I was 16, Genevieve. In the alley behind your father's dockhouse. You told me if I didn't put it on the burns, the scars would pull my skin too tight to hold a rifle. You never told me your name that night," I whispered. "You took my father's St. Jude medal from the shelf, and you were gone before the wagons arrived." Cassian reached into his waistcoat pocket and placed a heavy object onto the mahogany desk. It was an antique copper medallion, tarnished green around the edges, bearing the St. Jude cross. On the reverse side, scratched with a steel needle, were my childhood initials, G.M. 1919. "I didn't steal it," Cassian said softly. "Your father gave it to me before the roof fell. He told me to take the train north, build an empire no southern magistrate could touch, and come back for you when Thorne tried to collect his blood debt." "My father died in that fire," I said, my voice trembling. "Your father was murdered in that fire, Genevieve," Cassian corrected, his eyes turning to flint. "Garrick Thorne burned the St. Jude docks to wipe out the municipal grain ledgers and seize the southern rail terminal. He spent 7 years keeping you penniless so he could force you into a marriage contract and legitimize his theft." Before I could speak, the iron door of the catwalk slammed open. Inspector Declan Cole strode into the room, flanked by 2 Southern marshals in wet duster coats, brandishing a notarized scroll. Cassian Drake. You're harboring a fugitive. Miss Genevieve Mercer is under legal contract of marriage to Mr. Garrick Thorne, with a breach of promise warrant for $50,000. Cassian didn't reach for a weapon. He picked up the copper St. Jude medal, rolled it between his fingers, and looked at Cole like a beetle on his desk. You are standing on Highstone territory, Inspector, Cassian said, his voice dangerously level. The Southern Commonwealth has no jurisdiction north of the Iron Gorge. Genevieve Mercer entered this city under sovereign sanctuary. Cole sneered. Sanctuary won't heat your boilers, Drake. Mr. Thorne has halted all Southern anthracite coal shipments from the basin. The Northern power grid has 48 hours of fuel remaining. Hand the girl over, or your workers freeze in the dark before Sunday. The air in the glass office went dead. I looked through the glass down at the hundreds of men working below, men with families in the valley who depended on that coal. Cassian, I whispered, reaching out to touch his sleeve. If the city needs the coal. Cassian moved swiftly, covering my trembling fingers with his warm palm, gripping my hand with iron certainty. Declan, Cassian said, his eyes drilling into the inspector. Take this message back to Garrick Thorne. If a single freight car of coal is delayed past midnight, I will reroute 20,000 tons of northern steel through the Western Canal and bankrupt his shipping lines by morning. And if he crosses the Highstone Bridge with armed men, tell him to bring 50 coffins with him. Cole jammed the warrant back into his case, shaken. Thorne is already on his private locomotive, Drake. He'll be at Highstone Roundhouse at midnight to collect his bride. You're trading an empire for a dock girl. She is not a dock girl, Cassian said quietly, his grip on my hand tightening with fierce protection. She is the only reason this empire exists. Get off my mountain. When Cole marched out, I tried to pull my hand back, but Cassian held fast. Thorne will bring 50 mercenaries, Cassian. Your men shouldn't bleed for me. My captains don't bleed for you, Genevieve, Cassian said, looking into my eyes with an unyielding devotion that shattered the last wall around my heart. They stand because I stand. And I have waited 7 years to show Garrick Thorne what happens when a man tries to take what belongs to the northern rails. That afternoon, the wind died down, leaving an ominous, freezing silence over the valley. Word arrived that Garrick Thorne's armored locomotive, the Southern Goliath, was steaming north along the main line with 50 armed strikebreakers and private mercenaries. In my quarters, I was pacing the floor in front of the hearth. The weight of the impending conflict pressed against my ribs. In a moment of cold, desperate calculation, not cowardly surrender, but the fierce refusal to let an entire city of innocent rail families freeze for my sake, I slipped out the side servant's entrance into the freezing courtyard, wrapping a dark woolen cloak around my head. I intended to walk to the Valley Telegraph Station to send Thorne an ultimatum. I would sign over the entire Mercer family harbor claim in exchange for his turning the train around. It was the bravest, most costly mistake of my life. I had barely reached the perimeter switchyard when 2 Southern scouts who had infiltrated the outer fence stepped out from behind a frozen coal bunker, leveling short-barreled shotguns. Well now, one grunted, lunging for my cloak. The runaway bride came right to us. Before their hands could touch my shoulders, a rifle crack echoed through the frozen pines. The lead scout collapsed into the snow, clutching his shattered shoulder. Captain Joshua Sterling stepped from the shadow of the water tower, smoke curling from his lever-action Winchester. "Get behind the tender, Miss Mercer," Sterling shouted, pulling me behind the heavy steel plate of a parked locomotive just as 3 Southern bullets clanged off the iron boiler. Sterling returned fire, but as he leaned out to cover our retreat toward the main gate, a stray bullet tore through his upper arm, staining the white snow with crimson. "Captain!" I cried out, tearing the linen hem of my dress to bind his bleeding arm, tears of self-reproach burning my eyes. "I'm sorry. I thought I could stop the fight." "Don't apologize to me, child," Sterling grunted through clenched teeth, pressing the tourniquet. "The boss told us you'd try to carry the whole world on your back. That's why he had 6 of us shadowing you from the moment you stepped into the courtyard." Cassian arrived 30 seconds later at the head of a dozen armed northern guards. When he saw Sterling's bleeding arm and my snow-soaked dress, his face went completely white with terrifying fury. Instead of shouting, Cassian dropped to one knee in the freezing slush beside me. He grabbed my face between his bare, leather-scented hands, inspecting my eyes, my neck, my shivering lips for any sign of harm. "Are you hit?" His voice cracked with a raw, desperate terror that tore through his stoic armor. "No," I choked out, holding his wrists. "Cassian, Joshua is hurt because of me." Cassian closed his eyes for one long second, resting his forehead against mine in the middle of the blizzard. The heat of his skin and the scar pressed against my temple made the freezing storm disappear. "You don't negotiate with men who burn cities, Genevieve," he whispered against my hair. "You crush their tracks." He stood up, his fury hardening into pure diamond. He helped Sterling to his feet and turned to his lieutenant. "Bring the locomotive into the turntable," Cassian commanded. "Clear the outer tracks." We received Mr. Thorne in the center of the roundhouse. At 11:45 p.m., the colossal iron whistle of the southern Goliath screamed down the mountain pass, rattling the frosted window panes of Highstone Roundhouse. The massive steel doors groaned open. The armored southern train rolled slowly onto the central turntable plate, steam hissing in violent plumes against the midnight air. Garrick Thorne stepped down from the iron cowcatcher, flanked by 50 heavily armed mercenaries with automatic rifles and shotguns. Thorne was a massive man in a beaver coat, diamonds glittering on his heavy knuckles, a gold-headed cane tucked under his arm. "Drake!" Thorne's booming voice echoed off the curved brick walls. "I brought 50 guns to your iron barn. Hand over Genevieve Mercer, sign the coal treaty, and I won't level this city to the bedrock." I stood beside Cassian on the elevated control bridge, 50 feet above the floor. The wind tossed my dark hair, but I was no longer shivering. Cassian's arm was around my waist, an impenetrable mountain of devotion. Cassian stepped forward to the iron railing. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't draw a pistol. He spoke with the composed authority of a sovereign king who owned every bolt in the valley. "You brought 50 guns to an iron town, Thorne," Cassian said, his voice carrying clearly over the hiss of the steam boilers. "But every track you rode in on answers to her safety." Thorne gave a cruel, booming laugh. "You think your little workers can stop 50 Southern marshals? Aim at the bridge, boys." His men raised their rifles toward our catwalk. Cassian raised 2 fingers in the air. A deafening clank of heavy iron gears echoed through the floorboards. Before Thorne's men could pull a single trigger, the massive circular turntable beneath their locomotive began to spin. The turntable rotated 90 degrees, completely severing the tracks connecting Thorne's engine to the exit tunnel. Simultaneously, from the catwalks, the steam vents, and the dark locomotives surrounding the perimeter, 200 Northern Rail workers stepped into the light, holding heavy steel spanners, boiler-cutting torches, and high-caliber hunting rifles. Above the locomotive, Captain Sterling, his arm neatly bandaged in a sling, pulled an overhead release lever. 10,000 gallons of freezing mountain river water from the overhead locomotive filling tanks dumped directly onto the firebox of the Southern Goliath, dousing the coals in a roaring cloud of white steam and extinguishing the engine's power in a matter of seconds. Thorne's men stood ankle-deep in freezing slush, their rifles wet, their locomotive dead, surrounded by 200 stone-faced northern men who answered to the Drake crest. Thorne's face turned from red to ash. He dropped his gold cane into the mud, looking around at the impenetrable circle of steel and men. I looked down at the trembling, mud-splattered man who had terrorized my life for 7 years, and in that single breath of silence, the suffocating ghost of my childhood finally dissolved. Garrick Thorne was not an untouchable god, he was just a broken merchant standing powerless before a love he could never buy. Cassian walked down the iron spiral staircase and stopped 5 paces from the ruined southern oligarch. "The St. Jude Harbor fire is over, Thorne," Cassian said, tossing a heavy leather folder onto the wet engine plate. "Inside that folder is your confession, signed by your 3 southern accountants whom my men took into custody yesterday in New Savannah. You will sign the perpetual surrender of all southern rail claims north of the river, and you will sign the deed of the St. Jude Harbor back to Genevieve Mercer." "And if I refuse?" Thorne snarled, his voice cracking with defeated venom. "If you refuse," Cassian said, his eyes turning to black ice, "my men will push your armored train off the gorge trestle with you inside it. Choose." With shaking, ink-stained fingers, Garrick Thorne signed the parchment, surrendering every claim, every debt, and every lie he had built over 20 years. Quiet justice had arrived. Not through a bloody massacre, but through the absolute, immovable power of an empire built to protect what was sacred. 2 days later, the storm had completely cleared. The Highstone Roundhouse was back to humming life, the northern boilers glowing red with freshly cleared anthracite, locomotive steam rising peacefully into the pale blue mountain sky. I sat in Cassian's private library beside the roaring fieldstone fireplace. On the small oak desk before me lay the signed deeds to my family's harbor land in St. Jude. I looked at the documents, then at the crackling flames. The price of love was real. I knew in my heart that I could never go back to the sunny southern porches or the easy, naive life I had once imagined. My southern relatives would call me a traitor for standing beside the feared northern dawn. The Southern society would whisper about the girl who chose an empire of iron and snow over a traditional marriage. I picked up the Southern deed, walked to the hearth, and dropped it into the heart of the burning coals. The parchment blackened and curled into golden ash, rising up the chimney into the winter sky. A pair of warm hands settled gently onto my shoulders. I leaned back against Cassian's chest, breathing in the familiar scent of cedar, snow, and wool. He didn't speak. He reached around me and placed a heavy cast-iron key onto the oak mantelpiece, resting it right beside the polished copper St. Jude medal. "The southern tracks are sealed, Genevieve," he whispered into my hair. "This city is yours. If you want to leave tomorrow, every gate is open. If you stay, you will never walk alone again." I turned in his arms, looking up into the eyes of the man the entire world feared, the boy who had survived the fire, the king who had turned an entire mountain into my fortress. "I spent my whole life running from cages, Cassian," I said, my fingers tracing the silver scar on his collarbone. "I'm not running from home." His lips found mine in the golden firelight, sealing a vow that no winter storm or southern war could ever break. True safety is not finding a world without danger, it is finding the one dangerous man who chooses to be your fortress against the storm. If you were in Genevieve's shoes, would you have trusted the feared northern boss who held your ticket, or would you have kept running into the blizzard? If stories of fierce loyalty and claimed love speak to your heart, subscribe to Raven Vow.